Hello, and welcome to the first episode of my podcast, The History of Rioting in Pittsburgh. This starts with the Whiskey Rebellion and goes on to the railroad strike and the Homestead Steel Massacre. After the Revolution, the U.S. was in a major amount of debt, so George Washington raised the taxes of liquor to make up for it. Pittsburgh, being the largest producer of whiskey, was outraged. The main outrage was from Western PA farmers who would not be able to compete with the big distillers of the East Coast. Whiskey was not the only issue that they had with the federal government. The Indian Wars were making the frontier unsafe for settlers, and the Spanish, who controlled the Mississippi River, disallowed the farmers from using the river to trade. In modern-day Bridgeville area, the Battle of Bower Hill commenced between General Neville and 600 rebels led by Major James McFarland. A firefight commenced and the rebels wove a flag. Upon the surrender, they feigned and shot and killed the general. This led to the radicalization of the Pittsburgh area, where 7,000 poor people gathered in the Braddock fields. Even though these people weren't distillers or farmers, the whiskey tax allowed other grievances to come to play. They rioted against the wealthy populace who had no connection to the liquor tax. Tensions were high enough for the rioters to think about joining Spain or Britain against the U.S. and to bring the guillotine here. David Bradford, a lawyer who rose to prominence as a leader of the rebellion, had compared himself to Robespierre of the Reign of Terror. Pittsburgh citizens banished 3 men who offended the rebels and went to Braddock Fields to express support for the right to protest. They diffused the situation from a rebellion to a semi-violent protest where only the property of Major Kirkpatrick, who escaped the rebels at Bower Hill, was burned. President Washington responded by sending a delegation to the rebels for reconciliation, while he simultaneously also raised a militia. Though there weren't as many volunteers as the Revolution, they had the draft to fill in ranks. Forced conscription led to even more protests and riots breaking out across the country. At Carlisle, riots broke out and an officer accidentally shot an unarmed boy due to his gun misfiring. Another soldier bayoneted a protester to death. Washington arrested the men, but they were released. By the time George Washington's men reached Pittsburgh, 13,000 strong, the protests ceased without a shot being fired. All right, now we move on to the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. July 21st and 22nd, 40 people, including women and children, were killed in the riots. 40 buildings of the Union Depot rail yard were burnt into destruction. Damages ranged from $2 million to $5 million, and the trains did not run for a week after that due to rail damage. The Long Depression had dire implications for the country's industry, closing hundreds of railroads. Tensions from this created the Great Railroad Strike across the country, of which Pittsburgh had the most violence and damage than any other U.S. city. In 1877, Pittsburghers felt that the city was suffering due to the prices of the PA Railroad and blamed the railroad for losing the preeminence of the oil refining industry. In June of that year, the railroad announced that they would reduce the wages of all employees and officers by 10%. Then, they announced that they would double up on the cargo the trains carried through Pittsburgh, effectively cutting the jobs in half. The same day, the superintendent of the railroad decided that a day work would be extended to 116 miles from 46. A crew of railroaders defied their industrialist bosses and did not continue to run the train they worked. This led to firings and another crew to take place. These scavengers were attacked by the strikers. The strikers marched on East Liberty stockyards and captured the track, halting all railroad traffic. This led to fighting for control of the train yards between the strikers and the railroad loyalists. This was a quote from Sheriff David M. Watt, a loyalist to Robert Pitcairn, the superintendent of the railroad, in a letter to the governor. A tumult, riot, and mob exist on the Pennsylvania Railroad at East Liberty, and in the 12th Ward of Pittsburgh, large assemblages of people are upon the railroad, and the movement of freight trains either east or west are prevented by the intimidation and violence, molesting and obstructing the engineers and other employees of the railroad company in the discharge of their duties. As the sheriff of the county, I have endeavored to suppress the riot, but have not the adequate means at my command to do so, and I therefore request you to exercise your authority in calling out the military to suppress the same. By midnight, 1,500 rioters took the rail yards and stopped the same number of cars. General Albert Pearson assembled a regiment of the National Guard to support the sheriff. Pearson was reluctant in attacking, for it would have caused massive losses of life. After threatening the strikers with live rounds of ammunition, more reinforcements came for the strikers, bolstering them to 2,500. The same day, the acting governor telegraphed this message to Philadelphia. The situation in Pittsburgh is becoming dangerous. Troops are in sympathy, and in some instances with the strikers. Can you rely on yours? With the entire region's economy on a standstill, Alexander Cassett, the vice president of the PA Railroad, presented demands to the strikers. No more double loads, pay reinstated, rehirings of the laid-off workers, and the abolishment of pay grades for workers. In reply, the superintendent, Mr. Pitcairn, said, "Have no further talk with them. They've asked for things we cannot grant them at all." The next day, Pittsburgh police and the National Guard mutinied, joining the protesters, and another National Guard division was sent from Philadelphia. 300 soldiers were given 2 Gatling guns and 20 rounds for each personal rifle. They were ordered to arrest the mob's leaders, and when they arrived on 28th Street, they found 12,000 citizens with the mutinied troops. As the troops began to enforce the Riot Act, the protesters started wresting the rifles from the troops and threw stones at them. "Stick it to them, give it to them, don't fall back," was heard as the National Guard was attacked with pistols. This prompted the National Guard to lay waste on the protesters. The New York Herald described the firing as this: "The sight presented after the soldiers ceased fire was sickening and actually dotted with the dead and the dying." From that, 20 men, women, and children were killed, with another 29 wounded. The troops retreated, and the real rioting began. The shops were sacked, armories and factories were taken over for weaponry. At the time, Harper's Weekly reported on the situation. The news of the slaughter of the mob spread through the city like wildfire and produced the most intense excitement. The streets were rapidly crowded, and the wildest rumors prevailed. When the news reached the large number of rolling mill hands and workmen in the various shops of the city, they were excited to join the frenzy, and by 8 o'clock, the streets of the central portion of the city were alive with them. A large crowd broke into the manufactory of the Great Western Gun Works and captured 200 rifles and a quantity of small arms, and various other crowds sacked all other places in the city where arms were being exposed for sale, getting about 300 more. Among them were 1,000 mill hands from Birmingham on the south side. The Philly Guard was outnumbered by the rioters, and they retreated to the roundhouse of the depot. The rebels surrounded them, attempting to capture the artillery from the guard. They opened fire to prevent the opposition from manning it, and killing 15 men in the process. The rioters retreated, regrouped, and opened fire upon the soldiers. The mob could be heard saying, "We'll have them out if we have to roast them out." And they took cars filled with oil, coke, and whiskey and caught them on fire and pushed them towards the roundhouse. There is one soldier retreating recounted, "It was better to run the risk of being shot down than to be burned to death. And so we filled out into compact body. It was lively times, I tell you, reaching the U.S. Arsenal. I thought we should all be cut to pieces." The National Guard forces were fired on from the second floor windows and corners of the streets. They were also fired at from a police station where 8 or 10 policemen were in uniform. U.S. Commissioner of Labor Carroll D. Dwight would testify that some parts of the riot were instigated by agents of the railroad, destroying aged cars that they could charge to the county. Looters began pillaging the rail cars with the help of the police and destroyed the Union Depot. Next morning, townsfolk organized their own militia of several thousand under the command of General James Negley. Word was that 1,000 miners were coming to join the protests, and upon arrival were met by Negley and 2 companies of the 19th Regiment. He was able to defuse the situation and prompted the soldiers would return home if the miners and the rioters did as well. For total losses of this riot, 53 rioters were killed, 109 were injured, 8 soldiers were killed, and 15 were wounded, with a total of 139 arrests. The fires destroyed 39 buildings, 104 train engines, and around 1,400 train cars. 2 square miles of the city were reduced to ash. Estimates of the damage range from $2 million of lost freight, $5 million in damages to the city, but some sources say they could have been at least $10 million. It is also good to note that $10 million in 1877 has a relative inflated worth of $252,600,000. of today. Alright, so now we move on to the Irish and Italian clashes of 1886. Not as grand as the previous two, the Irish and Italian clashes of 1886 were some of the first racially charged riots of Pittsburgh history. Relations between the Irish Americans and Italian Americans were worsening, and the Italians moved into Greenfield, which was a prominent Irish neighborhood at the time. A gang of Irishmen led by the Daly brothers were able to attack an Italian named Joseph Vernard. Vernard escaped the group home, but the Daly brothers rounded up the 20 Irish laborers and broke into the barricaded Italian boarding house. As fights broke out across the house, Paddy Rocco had his skull crushed by a chair, and an Irishman named Patrick Constantine was also shot in the stomach. Before police came, the rioters fled and only 5 Italians were arrested. Patrick Constantine died at the hospital. Alright, so now this talks about the Homestead Steel Massacre. 16 people died in the strike, with numbers from both sides. As Carnegie Steel was making world-changing innovation, the wages of the workers dropped. An amalgamated association of iron and steel works, also known as AA, was a labor union that represented the craftsmen of the Homestead Steel Works. The AA strike was organized, purposeful, and paved the way for modern protests. Unlike the previous uprisings, which were leaderless and disorganized, the AA had a focus of ironworks west of the Allegheny Mountains and negotiated a national uniform wage scale, helped regulate working hours, workloads, and work speeds, and effectively improving the work conditions. In 1881, they were striking against independently owned Bessemer Steel Works, and violence broke out. The workers' union ended up victorious. Another strike occurred 3 years later when the contract was set to expire. The town was taken over by the strikers and led 2,000 of the town people with them. After the strikers drove off the strikebreakers, the sheriff returned with 125 deputized agents. But then, a total of 5,000 townspeople were backing the AA. So after the second successful strike, the membership of the AA doubled, and the Homestead Union was growing belligerent. Henry Clay Frick was put in charge of the Carnegie Steel in 1881. He wanted to break the AA Union, and he sent a letter to Carnegie, who was vacationing in Scotland. The mills have never been able to turn out the product they should, owing be held back by the amalgamated men. Carnegie favored unions and condemned the use of strikebreakers and said that a steel mill was not worth blood, but he did want to get out of the contract with the amalgamated and responded to Frick by saying, "Organize the whole affair and have the exact good reasons for employing every man. Far too many men required by the amalgamated rules." And then he ordered the plant to stock up on inventory in case of a strike. June 30th, 1892 was when the contract was set to expire, so Frick met with the leaders of the AA and started negotiations. The AA wanted a wage increase and represented almost a quarter of the plant's workers. Frick responded by cutting wages by 22% so the union could break and have lower chances at negotiations. Carnegie encouraged Frick to use the talks to gain the upper hand and said this, "The firm has decided that the minority must give way to the majority. These works, therefore, will not necessarily be non-union after the expiration of the present agreement." Carnegie believed that AA was hindering the factory's efficiency and that it was an elitist organization who only let in a small group of workers. Frick said if there was no negotiations by the expirement of the contract, that Carnegie Steel would no longer recognize the AA as a union. Carnegie approved of the tactic. Frick offered a wage increase and said, "We do not care if a man belongs to a union or not, nor do we wish to interfere. He may belong to as many unions or organizations as he chooses, but we think our employees at Homestead Steel Works would fare much better working under the system in vogue at Edgar Thomas and Duquesne." The day before the contract expired, Frick locked the workers out of the mill and was already fortifying the steel plant with tall barbed fences, sniper towers, spotlights, high-pressured water cannons that could shoot boiling water, and reinforced much of the mill. The workers dubbed it Fort Frick. Local AA leaders said that Frick broke the contract by locking them out a day before the contract expired. Another union group working for the Homestead Mill, the Knights of Labor, who represented the mechanics and the locomotive workers, also joined the AA in striking. Carnegie workers' plants across the region such as Beaver, Duquesne, and Union Falls fell in sympathy with their Homestead peers. The declaration of the strike committee, dated July 20th, 1892, reads in part, "The employees of the mill of Messrs. Carnegie, Phipps & Co. at the Homestead, PA, have built their town with its homes, its schools, and its churches, have for many years been faithful co-workers with the company in the business of the mill, have invested thousands of dollars in their savings in said mill in expectation of spending their lives in Homestead and of working in the mill during the period of their efficiency. Therefore, the committee desires to express the public as its firm belief that both the public and employees foresaid have equitable rights and interests in said mill which cannot be modified or diverted without the due process of law, that the employees have the right to continuous employment in said mill during the efficiency and good behavior without regard to religious, political, or economic opinions or associations. That is against public policy and subversive of the fundamental principles of American liberty that a whole community of workers should be denied the employment or suffer any social detriment on the account of membership in a church, a political party, or a trade union. That is our duty as American citizens to resist by every legal and ordinary means that the unconstitutional, anarchic, and revolutionary policy of the Carnegie Company, which seems to invent a contempt for public and private interests and a disdain for the public conscience. The strikers were determined to keep the plant closed, so they patrolled the river, setting up military units, 24-hour watch shifts to prevent trains and ferries from leaving. Even strangers in town were sent away. Reporters were issued special badges for safe passage, and owners of the bars were asked to keep drinking limited. Frick sent out to employ new workers from places as far as Boston, St. Louis, and even Europe. But newly hired strikebreakers were driven off by the protesters. On Independence Day of that year, Frick requested Sheriff William McCleary to intervene. McCleary responded by dispatching 11 deputies to the town to hand out a cease and desist letter to the strikers. The deputies were repelled by the strikers and forced on a boat downriver. Philander Knox, the company's lawyer, devised a plan to assemble 300 Pinkerton agents that would gain access to the plant from the river. The Pinkertons attempted to land at 4 a.m., utilizing the cover of darkness. Protesters followed the Pinkertons up the river and began to throw stones on the hired agents, but the leaders of the strike called for restraint. The wired fences were pulled down and they stormed the Homestead plant grounds. As the agents disembarked, shots were fired. It is unclear who shot first, but the captain of the Pinkertons was shot and another member in the crowd. The firefight continued for 10 minutes, killing 4 and wounding 24 people. The strikers then hid behind the iron scraps in the yard, and the tugboat that brought the Pinkertons left them stranded on the river. Hundreds of women were gathering on the banks of the river, calling for the strikers to kill the Pinkertons. A cannon was set up on the opposite side of the steel mill with the intent to sink the barges, but friendly fire may have come to play. Soon, thousands of steel workers, many of them armed and from Pittsburgh, were on their way to march on to Homestead to help their peers. When the Pinkertons attempted to disembark again, they were met with gunfire from high above the riverbanks. The agents returned fire and killed 4 more strikers. Soon, many of the Pinkertons refused to fight, and even some jumped from the barges. When the tugboat rallied back, it was met by heavy gunfire by 300 riflemen on the high ground, forcing the boat to retreat and killed its captain. A sniper was able to kill a medical student attending the wounded Pinkertons. The gunfire continued, and the strikers attempted to burn the Pinkertons' barges. They loaded rafts up with oil-soaked timber and pushed them towards the agents, and dynamite was also thrown, but did little damage to the barges. The AA tried to defuse the situation and pleaded to the sheriff to request a meeting with Frick. Frick denied the meeting. He knew that the more chaotic it became, the governor would call the state militia. The sheriff was hesitant in calling the governor, but was pressed and sent a telegram, describing of how the deputies and the Pinkertons were driven off and the protesters ranged 5,000. The governor responded by telling the sheriff to use all resources necessary to restore order. McCleary asked again for help, and the governor responded again by telling the sheriff to find his own men. AA leaders also attempted to urge the strikers to let the Pinkertons surrender, but they were shouted down and drowned out by the fireworks bombarding the barges. Some leaders suggested that the Pinkertons be charged with murder, lay down their arms, and expelled from the town, and the crowd approved with shouting. After 14 hours of firefighting, the Pinkertons raised a white flag and talked to the leaders of the strike. They agreed to the terms. As they went through the crowd, the Pinkertons were spat upon, rocks were thrown at them, and some were beaten into unconsciousness. The agents were paraded throughout the town, and the townsfolk continued to assault them. Horrified, the town officials were shocked at the treatment of the agents, and the abuse helped turn the sympathies away from the strikers. Soon a train arrived to take the Pinkerton men out of the town, and their murder charges were dropped. The total number of Pinkertons that died in the battle were 7, and the ones wounded were 11. The total number of Pinkertons captured was 324, and on the barges there was 360 rifles and provisions for a week. Strike leaders went to Harrisburg to plead the governor to send in the state militia. Governor Pattinson was hesitant to bring them out due to the fear of a massacre occurring. He finally felt the need to act due to being backed and elected by Carnegie's political machine. On July 12th, the state militia unexpectedly arrived in the town, and their commander, Major General George Snowden, sympathized with the protesters but took control of the situation. He is quoted saying, "I want you to distinctly understand that I am the master of this situation." More than 4,000 soldiers surrounded the plant, and 2,000 were overlooking the city. Within an hour, the picketers were displaced, and the officials of the plant were allowed in. The company brought in strike breakers, mostly black laborers and Slavic immigrants, and built quarters and mess halls for them. The picketeers rushed the militiamen to gain access to the plant, but the soldiers bayoneted 6 of them. Soon, a race war broke out inside the plant between the blacks and the Slavics. The leaders of the strike appealed to the Republican candidate for Vice President Whitelaw Reid, who urged Frick to reopen the talks with the AA due to the strike hurting the Republican ticket. Frick refused. A week later, martial law was declared and disheartening many of the protests. Many of the leaders of the protests were arrested and charged with conspiracy, riot, and murder. Each man had a $10,000 bond. The union retaliated with charges of murder against the company's executives. They too had a $10,000 bond. A compromise between the groups allowed all charges to be dropped. And on July 23rd, Frick was shot and stabbed by a New York anarchist, Alexander Berkman. Berkman had no connection to the situation and was sentenced 22 years in prison. Frick miraculously survived the assassination. This was the final straw, and the support for the movement drastically fell. As the support evaporated, some mills owned by Carnegie continued the protests on their end. AA affiliates in Union Falls held out till August of the next year, but the company was already operating at full capacity. The aftermath of the strike broke the AA. No other companies would sign their contracts. By 1900, all steel plants in Pennsylvania were deunionized. Strikers continued for the next 2 decades but were unsuccessful. The AA was taken over by the Steel Workers Organizing Committee in 1935. 6 years later, the organizations came to merge and created the United Steel Workers.